According to psychiatry, a psychopath is not considered legally insane. That is, he knows the difference between right and wrong. These individuals do not have intellectual problems, obvious psychosis, or brain damage, but are driven by the inability to feel empathy and act without hesitation. In the spring and summer of 1974, in the northwest of the United States, a psychopath began a series of attacks that terrified the area. Young scholars began disappearing from their homes. Large college campuses, some were last seen just feet from their sorority house. Others disappeared in small towns at night and were found naked with signs of sexual assault and strangulation. These victims had something in common. They were young, thin, white women with long hair parted in the middle. And they always disappeared at night. Witnesses denied the presence of a strange man on campus, often wearing a sling or a cast. Looking frail and pleading for help, however. Some women, noticing something strange, avoided approaching him or followed his car, suspecting that he might be a sexual predator. As the number of disappearances increased, so did the public clamor for answers. Pressure on authorities increased, and the media began to question why the bodies of the missing young women had not been found, leading many to believe that the victims had died because of the lack of progress in the search. At the time, King County, where many of the disappearances occurred, was the largest city in the country. Based on the above passage, the detailed autopsy is more compelling. I'm Brian Emendor, and welcome back to a special episode of Lost Bones. Today, we're exploring a case that shocked the nation, one where darkness creeps into the safest of places, college campuses. Back in 1974, in the northwest of the United States, a region that was once considered peaceful and virtually a series of strange disappearances left the police force facing an unprecedented challenge. In 1972, the area had only recorded 11 murders, 9 of which were solved. But in 1974, everything changed. A wave of bloody murders, blamed on a single man who would later be known to the nation as Ted, sent the community into a state of panic. But if 1974 was the beginning of the nightmare, 1978 was when it reached an unprecedented level. And on a Saturday night in January in Florida, the peace of Omega Republic, one of Florida State University's most prestigious sororities, was shattered forever. That night, while most of the students were out partying off campus, a few of the girls stayed in the house. Around 3 a.m., Nita Neary returned home and immediately noticed something was wrong. The back door was wide open. Before she could react, a loud noise came from upstairs. Panicking, she hid in the shadows and saw a thin man in a baseball cap and dark jacket hurrying out of the building. In his hand was a strange object, something like a cloth-wrapped stick with a metal tip. Nita woke her roommate, and with only an umbrella for protection, they searched the rooms together. Soon after, they found Karen Chandler, her face covered in blood, staggering in the hallway. Another victim, C.F. Kleiner, also seriously injured, was moaning on the edge of her bed. Panic set in when they realized someone else was missing. After calling 911, initially mistaken for a jealous fight, the police arrived at the scene and discovered a scene of carnage. Lisa Levy's body lying in an awkward position, with signs of strangulation and gruesome bite marks. A hairspray can with hair in it was found in the trash, later determined to be the rape weapon. Further investigation into the remaining rooms revealed the body of Margaret Bowman, a pillow soaked in blood, a pair of tights strangled around her neck, a smashed skull with part of her brain exposed. Pieces of bark were strewn about the room, suggesting that the killer had used a homemade weapon, possibly picked up from the backyard. 2 girls dead. 2 more badly injured. No one heard a thing. Not a cry for help, not a scream. The killer acted in complete silence, and he did not stop. Just a few hours later, not far away, another woman was awakened by strange noises coming from the house next door. She shook her roommate, and when they tried to listen, the terrifying echoes of another attack were taking place. Even as they were still recovering from the tragedy at the Omega Republic, as the strange noises continued to echo from the house next door, 2 young women staying nearby couldn't ignore them. They heard the moans weak, broken, like a cry for help. They called their friend's house, but no one answered, so they called the police. Deputies Ken Katsaris was the first to arrive. His police instincts told him this was no ordinary break. A crazy theory began to form in his head. A serial killer was operating on campus, and then it was Katsaris who broke down the front door. In the dark room, he came across a chilling sight. Cherry Thomas, 21, a top student and talented dancer, was sitting on her bed, her face smeared with mascara and blood, barely aware of her surroundings. On the floor, next to the foot of the bed, was a mask made from women's pantyhose, a scene too similar to what had been discovered earlier at the Omega Republic. From the mask, 2 strands of male hair were recovered, fragile evidence that would later prove crucial in identifying the killer. Investigators also found blood, semen, and partial fingerprints. Despite the scant evidence, authorities concluded that Cherry's attacker was responsible for the Omega massacre. At the hospital, Cherry was diagnosed with a dislocated shoulder, a broken jaw, and a skull fractured in 5 different places. Doctors were amazed that she had survived, but the price she paid was high. Cherry would never hear again in her left ear. and she would lose her balance, which meant she would have to give up her dream of becoming a professional dancer. Horrific attack sparked the most intense manhunt of its time. The killer, later known as Eddie Andohead, set off a series of brutal acts unprecedented in the history of American universities. But the worst was yet to come. Nearly a month later, in Jacksonville, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department received a report of a near kidnapping. The victim was 14-year-old Leslie Portmetter, who was waiting for her brother in the parking lot of Jebstart High School in a pouring rain. A white pickup truck pulled up, and a man got out. He was wearing plaid pants, an old army jacket, a bushy beard, long, wavy hair, and black-rimmed glasses. The man claimed to be a firefighter, even wearing a badge and holding up identification. In the name, Richard Burton, but Leslie quickly sensed something was wrong. He was dirty, his eyes were vacant, his voice was off, no firefighter she had ever known. She remembered her father, Detective James Pormeter, telling her never to talk to strangers. She tried to walk away, but the man blocked her path and continued to question her. Just then, Leslie's brother arrived in a pickup truck, demanding that she get in the car. When confronted by the man, he became agitated and quickly drove away. Fortunately, his brother had written down the license plate number, 13D300. When Leslie's father looked up the license plate, he discovered it belonged to a Rendell Regan in Tava, but due to work commitments, he was unable to investigate further. Meanwhile, in the town of Lake City, located between Jacksonville and Tallahassee, another case was recorded, revealing a new chapter in the never-ending nightmare. News of another missing person case continues to shake the local community. This time the victim is Kimberly Diane Elfa, 12-year-old girl who mysteriously disappeared from the parking lot of her high school, leaving no trace. Her parents, in a panic, immediately called the police. At the same time, Jacksonville investigator James Lear Pormeter, who was investigating a case involving his daughter being approached by a strange man, contacted the Leon County Sheriff's Department to check on Randall Reagan, the legal owner of the suspicious white van. With this lead, investigator Steve Bodford took over the case and quickly discovered that Reagan had reported his license plate missing and had applied for a new one, which added to the suspicions. More importantly, Randall Reagan lived very close to the scene of the attack on Cherry Thomas, the lucky survivor in the recent string of cases. Bodford's intuition warned that these might not be isolated incidents. The news of Kimberly's disappearance only added to the growing anxiety. Given the brutality of the attack, investigators feared that if the Omega Republic attacker had been the one who had approached Kimberly, her chances of survival were slim to none. James, the father, was horrified at the thought that his daughter had been so close to a killer. Days later, the investigation was deadlocked, until a turning point came. One evening in Pensacola, Patrolman David Lee spotted an orange Volkswagen Beetle driving suspiciously around a small restaurant. When he checked the license plate, he discovered it was stolen. A chase ensued. After more than a mile, the car stopped. But when David approached and demanded that the driver surrender, the man jumped up, attacked him, and tried to flee. During the struggle, David was forced to open fire. The man fell, but continued to fight back, clearly intending to kill the officer. David eventually subdued the suspect, handcuffed him, and took him to the station. On the way to the station, the suspect appeared desperate, repeatedly saying he wished he had been shot dead on the spot. This puzzled David. He did not appear to be drunk or under the influence of drugs. At the station, Detective Norman Chapman Jr. was assigned to interview him. When asked for his name, the man gave his name as Kenneth Raymond Minsner. However, inside the Beetle, police discovered 3 different identification documents, all student IDs with fake names. In addition, there were 21 stolen credit cards, a TV, fake license plates, a bicycle, and various items related to other jurisdictions such as Leon and Tallahassee. Norman realized that he was more than just a car thief. He was likely the mastermind behind a series of brutal crimes. Both the Leon and Tallahassee police departments were immediately notified. The next day, Detective Stephen Bodford and Bishop Petchin arrived to interview the suspect. He agreed to be recorded, but refused to give his real name, asking only to see a lawyer and a priest. For hours, he remained absolutely silent, until February 16, 1978, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The cold man suddenly looked up, smiled, and announced his name as Robert Bundy, clearly expecting a horrified reaction from the police. But no one seemed to recognize his name. It was only when one of the investigators flipped through the FBI files that they were shocked to discover this was Theodore Robert Bundy, one of America's 10 most wanted men. He was prosecuted for many crimes, from theft, assault, kidnapping, murder, and most notably to prison breaks. During subsequent interviews, Ted Bundy oscillated between stony faces and emotional outbursts. He broke down in tears as he talked about his childhood and past, but skillfully evaded questions about the murders. Investigator Norman Chapman began to realize that they had not just a suspect but America's most notorious serial killer, and that what they had just uncovered was only the tip of the iceberg. Asterisk in a last-ditch effort to get to the suspect, the investigators decided to try a different approach. They asked him directly, "Have you ever tried to erase your fingerprints?" Ted began to cry and confessed that he regularly wore leather gloves. When asked about a stolen white van near campus, he refused to comment. The questioning then turned to allegations in Colorado, where a young college student had gone missing and was found dead. Ted claimed to know nothing, but when pressed, he surprisingly admitted that he had seen autopsy photos. At that point, he asked that the recording device be turned off. What happened next was not recorded, but was kept in the investigator's notebook, and it was in that silence that Ted began to speak. He called himself a vampire and admitted that he had stalked, and haunted young women. When asked if he ever acted out his sick fantasies, Ted replied that fantasies consumed my life, and that reality was always disappointing. Investigators believed he was responsible for at least 36 murders. When confronted with the number, Ted's response was shock. "You need to add another number." The room fell silented. "He mean 37 victims, or more than 100. Ted went on to reveal a gruesome detail. He had removed the passenger seat from his car to make it easier to transport cargo. The police immediately understood that he was referring to the bodies. When investigator Norman Chapman asked directly where Kimberly was buried, Ted simply shook his head. "It's too horrible to describe." When he was transferred to the Leon County Jail, investigators decided to try one last time. They didn't question him. They didn't threaten him, just that Kimberly's parents deserved to know the truth so they could bury their daughter. Ted reacted violently. He crumpled up his pack of cigarettes, threw himself on the floor, and said, "But I'm the coldest son of a bitch you ever met." With that, any hope of a confession about Kimberly's body vanished. The name Theodore Bundy began to fill the headlines. The media was finally connecting the murders that had been scattered over the years. The mysterious serial killer now had a face, a name, and was at the center of one of the most shocking cases in American criminal history. But to fully understand his crimes, we have to go back to where it all began. The first disappearance, the first body, and the first names that had slowly faded into obscurity until the horror was revealed. Ted Bundy's first alleged victim was 15-year-old Catherine Mary Devine. She disappeared from a quiet street corner in North Seattle. On November 25, 1973, the last witness saw her trying to hitchhike. Nearly 2 weeks later, her body was found in a wooded area, badly decomposed. Although fully clothed, her jeans had been slashed down the back, and an autopsy confirmed that she had been strangled and sexually assaulted. The case stalled due to a lack of leads. Then, just a few weeks later, in early 1974, a new name appeared on the victim list. Karen Sparks, an 18-year-old college student, lived in the basement of a house on the University of Washington campus. On the morning of January 5th, her roommates noticed that Karen had not woken up. Thinking she had overslept, they were not too worried until a friend went downstairs to check on her. He found Karen unconscious, her face covered in blood. When he pulled back the covers, he was horrified to find a metal rod had been pulled out of the bed frame and used to attack her. Karen Sparks was rushed to the hospital in critical condition after being brutally attacked in her basement room. Doctors found severe injuries, including severe damage to her bladder and vagina, the result of a metal rod being inserted into her body. The case shocked the entire Washington University campus community. But even though police were called in, shortly afterward, no definitive evidence of the perpetrator was found at the scene. For weeks, the press continued to report, but all leads came to naught. And then, just as the fear was beginning to subside, another case surfaced, this time involving a name familiar to thousands of morning radio listeners in western Washington. Linda Ann Healy, 21, was a bright prospect at the University of Washington. She was about to graduate with a psychology degree and was also the morning news anchor for Northwest Ski Reports. Every day, her pleasant voice blared from radios across the state. But none of her fans knew her true identity, and none of them suspected that she would one day become the victim of one of America's most gruesome murders. Linda lived with 4 friends in an old house near her college campus. She grew up in a stable middle-class family in eastern Washington, had been a member of the church choir, loved to cook, and had planned to work with children with disabilities. By then, Linda and her friends had learned about the horrific attack on Karen Sparks, which had occurred just a few blocks away, and they were extremely cautious, locking their doors, staying out at night, and avoiding strangers. But Linda was active and had a set routine. She would wake up at 5:30 a.m. to go to the radio station, then go to class, and go home at the end of the day. Despite her boyfriend's frequent absences, Linda remained upbeat. In a recent letter home, she excitedly mentioned that she was going to invite her parents over for a beef stroganoff dinner that she had prepared. On February 1, 1974, Linda began the evening by going with a friend to Dante's, a popular bar for University of Washington students. They drank 2 pitchers of beer, chatted, and then headed home. No one knew that when Linda went down to her basement room, it would be the last time anyone would see her. The next morning, her radio colleagues began to worry when Linda didn't show up for work, and the alarm clock in her room kept going off. One of her roommates went down to check. Linda's room was neat, the bed was made, but she was nowhere to be found. One small detail made her uneasy. Linda's pink satin pillowcase was missing. The police were called shortly afterward. The homicide team entered the small room, finding it decorated with photographs, posters, and Linda's personal items. But, when the sheets were pulled back, they found dried blood on the mattress, a trail that ran from the pillow to the foot of the bed. The pillowcase was missing, and there was no sign of a struggle, as if Linda had been taken quietly in her sleep. Although it was initially unclear whether the scene was a murder or a kidnapping, investigators knew one thing: this was no ordinary missing persons case. Once again, a predator had entered, slipped quietly through a locked door, and carried off a young woman from her own home without a sound, without a trace. When investigators took a closer look at Linda Healy's bedroom closet, they found one of her shirts stuffed into the bottom of a drawer, its collar soaked with dried blood. The discovery reinforced the theory that Linda had been attacked in her sleep, knocked unconscious, and then carried away while she was defenseless. The clothes she had worn the night before, jeans, a sweater, leather boots, and a backpack containing her clothes, were also missing. Investigators suspected that her attacker had changed her clothes before leaving. In an attempt to cover up any traces, after her disappearance, Linda's roommates moved out quietly, without telling anyone, and a group of boys moved in, hoping that if the attacker returned, he would be caught red-handed. The neighborhood was searched for several days, but there was no sign of Linda, even in her room. The perpetrator seemed to have left no visible evidence, not a fingerprint, not a hair dot. As the investigation stalled, a strange call came in from the Washington Police Dispatch. The man on the line claimed that Karen Sparks, attacker, and Linda Healy's kidnapper were the same person. Though suspicion initially fell on Linda's current and former boyfriends, both passed polygraph tests. With no other choice, investigators were forced to treat the case as a kidnapping and, possibly, a homicide with no body. The Seattle Crime Lab received several samples from the scene, but the results were inconclusive. Still, investigators began to see similarities between Linda and Karen. Both had lived in homes with other girls. Both had bedrooms in the basement, and both had been attacked at night when their friends weren't looking. In Linda's case, the perpetrator clearly decided to take the victim with him. Linda's disappearance was a huge shock. She was a loving person who cared for disabled children and had a voice that was familiar to thousands of radio listeners every morning. Now her face was plastered across the front pages of newspapers, becoming a symbol of the fear spreading across Washington state. And then, not far from Seattle, a new disappearance occurred. On March 12, 1974, Donna Gail Manson, a 19 student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus and never returned. She had a history of mild depression, leading police to initially suspect she had run away or committed suicide. But after Donna's writings, diaries, and drawings were submitted to a psychiatric evaluation, the conclusion was there was no sign of serious mental disorder. The search began. Dogs were deployed, the woods around the school were searched. Nothing was found, not a trace. And then, in the silence, the authorities began to realize these were no longer isolated disappearances. On April 17, 1974, a new disappearance was reported. Susan Elaine Runcourt, 18, a freshman at Central Washington College in Ellensburg, disappeared. After dropping off laundry in her dormitory laundry room, police followed her route and discovered a shortcut, albeit dangerous, that led past a construction site, a wooden bridge over a pond, and a deserted parking lot. They believe this is where Susan was ambushed. Several female students began reporting similar experiences. A tall, handsome young man with an arm in a cast or sling would often ask for help carrying books or supplies. He would appear around the wooden bridge and parking lot where Susan was last seen. Although the description matched, police did not have enough concrete evidence. Less than 3 weeks later, on May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks, a student at Oregon State University majoring in global religions, left her room to attend a meeting. With friends, she never arrived. Roberta's roommate said she would return in an hour, but she disappeared without a trace. Police suspected she had left, but her body was never found. The kidnapping theory quickly took hold. Roberta's case was linked to previous disappearances in Washington. Less than a month later, Brenda Carroll Ball's turn came. Brenda, 22, was last seen in the parking lot after leaving the Flame Tavern late at night. She was chatting with a tall, brown-haired man whose arm was in a sling. Her account was a carbon copy of the description of the stranger who had approached the previous victims. On June 10, 1974, the horror reached its peak. Georgian Hawkins, 18, a bright student at the University of Washington, disappeared, just steps away from saying hello to her boyfriend at a fraternity. She was studying for her final Spanish exam, a subject that had made her so nervous that she considered dropping out. After leaving a small party on campus, Georgian walked the short distance home but never arrived. The next morning, her friends called the police in panic. Detective Bud Burr, when he took the case, immediately remembered the photos of other missing girls plastered on his office wall. The police followed up on eyewitness accounts. Some said they had seen Georgian on the road. They called her name in the dark, but it was her calls that may have inadvertently revealed her identity to the ambusher. The question remained, why had no one seen anything? No cries for help, no sign of a struggle. The answer may have been the deadly composure of the predator, a tall, handsome man with a confident smile, a cast on his arm, and a blank stare. The man who had left a state in fear throughout the summer of 1974, a female witness recounted that she had seen a young man with a cast on his arm, struggling to lift a suitcase with handles, but kept dropping it. The man appeared helpless, appealing to her compassion. The girl offered to help, but said she needed to run into the house to get something first. When she returned a few minutes later, he had disappeared. The disappearance of Georgian Hawkins was a wake-up call for investigators. Many young women had narrowly escaped their attackers. After compiling all the cases, they came to a clear conclusion. These disappearances were not random. One man alone, was behind them all. With at least one victim confirmed murdered, the investigation became urgent. On June 3, 1974, more than 100 law enforcement officers from Washington and Oregon met at Evergreen State College in Olympia. They shared all the information they had. During the meeting, the Redmond police officers reviewed two notable missing persons cases, Catherine, Mary Devine, and Donna Manson. However, they also added a new case, Brenda Baker, a 15-year-old hitchhiker who had disappeared on May 25. Her body was found more than a month later in Milwaukee State Park in an advanced state of decomposition. Coincidentally, this was just a few miles from McKinney Park, where Catherine's body had been found. The meeting ended without a breakthrough, but no one denied it. They were dealing with a serial killer. Things really came to a head on Sunday, July 14, 1974, a sunny summer day with temperatures reaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Lake Sammamish, a state park known for its picnics and wildflowers in the summer, was packed. That's where Janice, OTT 23, decided to relax. As a probation officer at the King County Juvenile Correctional Center and the daughter of a public school principal, Janice knew the mind of a criminal. But that day she wasn't thinking about it. She went to the park and then disappeared into the crowd around noon. Just a few hours later, Denise Naslin, an 18-year-old college student, came to the park with her boyfriend and another couple. Around 4 p.m., she left the group to use the bathroom and also disappeared without a trace. As soon as the information was received, the Seattle Police Department knew the killer had resurfaced. Janice and Denise's case was assigned to a team of investigators, including Robert Keppel, who had only worked one homicide at the time, but would become the lead expert in the years-long manhunt. Witnesses described a man with an arm in a cast and a sling, calling himself Ted, repeatedly approaching women in the park, asking them to help him move a sailboat to his car. He approached at least 10 people. One woman almost followed him, but then became suspicious when he invited her near a silver-brown Volkswagen Beetle. Based on the statements, a sketch of the suspect was created and broadcast across the state. Ted was described as male, with light brown, wavy hair, good looks, a clear voice, and a polite manner, but with a suspicious eye toward women. Immediately, police received hundreds of calls. Everyone knew some Ted who fit the description, but most had alibis. Still, investigators began to see something was wrong. Why would he abduct 2 women in just 4 hours? The most terrifying theory put forward: Ted was increasingly out of control, needing more and more stimulation. It was possible that Janice had been captured first and taken into custody, before Denise was taken as his second victim. In his sick imagination, he may have wanted a double vision, one victim watching, the other being tortured, raped, even murdered. A fantasy too gruesome to imagine, but perfectly suited to the character of the man they were hunting. And then the terrible truth began to emerge. In mid-August 1974, a worker named Monte Taylor was working on a construction site near Lake Sammamish and noticed a foul smell coming from a cliff. He looked over but left because he was hungry. It wasn't until September 6 that another worker decided to investigate. He found a human jaw, rib cage, and spine. The police were called, and the scene was cordoned off. Although the summer heat and wildlife destroyed most of the remains, the forensic team recovered 8 hairs, several small bones, a complete skull, and femurs, and all of the victims were naked. Subsequent testing confirmed the remains, those of Janice OTT and Denise Naslin, but 2 other victims remained unidentified. With that discovery, an official task force was formed. They set up shop in the King County Courthouse, where the walls were covered with photos of the victims, detailed maps of the missing areas, and a sketch of Ted hung in the center of the room. September passed tensely without any more discoveries, but on October 18th, the nightmare continued. Melissa N. Smith, 17, the daughter of the Midvale police chief, disappeared after leaving home to visit friends. She never arrived. Her body was found in the mountains near a parking lot. She had been beaten beyond recognition, strangled with nylon stockings, and had been sexually assaulted both vaginally and anally. An autopsy found that she had been alive for 7 days. After her capture, meaning she had been held captive, tortured, and then killed. Just days later, on Halloween, another 17-year-old girl, Laura Aim, disappeared while out for a night. Out in Lehi, Utah, the killer is still walking among Usand. The list of victims continues. It was Halloween night when her body was found. She had been strangled with a pair of nylon stockings. The coroner's report listed a fractured skull at the back of her head. Signs of sexual assault were undeniable. Semen samples were collected from her genital area. The police forensics lab attempted to determine the attacker's blood type, but the samples had deteriorated too severely to be usable. While this horror unfolded in one part of Utah, 18-year-old Carol Duranch was preparing for a seemingly ordinary evening. She drove her brand-new Camaro to Fashion Place Mall around 6:30 p.m. and spent time with relatives before stopping into Waldenbrook. There she was approached by a well-dressed, attractive man who asked her if she had parked near Sears. When Carol said yes, the man claimed that someone had attempted to break into her car using a wire coat hanger. The man spoke and acted like a police officer, even though he wasn't in uniform. Trusting him, Carol followed him out to the parking lot under a light drizzle. As they walked, she requested to see his badge. He laughed off the question, making Carol feel awkward, even embarrassed. When they reached her Camaro, everything looked normal. The man then asked her to open the passenger door. She refused, insisting that they speak with his partner at the mall's security office. The man suggested they file a formal complaint. Carol agreed but expected to see a patrol car. Instead, they walked to a beat-up Volkswagen Beetle. Alarm bells rang in her head. When she asked again for ID, the man showed a driver's license briefly, and all Carol could catch was a flash of yellow dot. He opened the passenger door and waited for her to enter. She hesitantly climbed in. As he started the car, she smelled alcohol on his breath. Before she could react, they had already pulled away. Carol debated jumping from the car but hesitated. Then, the man suddenly pulled over. His demeanor shifted. He went silent, cold. When Carol tried to escape, he tackled her and snapped a pair of handcuffs onto one wrist. She screamed. He pulled a gun and threatened to kill her if she didn't stop yelling. In the chaos, Carol managed to fall backward out of the Beetle. She kicked him in the groin, causing him to stumble. She bolted toward the highway, terrified. A passing couple stopped and rescued her. Shaken, she was brought to the local police station. At the station, officers were unable to remove the handcuffs. No standard keys worked. Back at the mall, no sign of the Beetle or the man was found. Carol tried to identify her attacker from mug shots, but none matched. A small blood stain on her jacket collar was tested type O, but the sample was too degraded for RH factor typing. Meanwhile, that same evening, another girl went missing. Deborah Jean Kent, 17, vanished during intermission at a high school theater performance in Bountiful, Utah. Witnesses recalled a terrifying scream in the parking lot between 10:30 and 11 p.m., prompting several people to step outside. They saw nothing, just an empty parking space. One of Deborah's friends remembered seeing a handsome but anxious-looking man pacing near the theater earlier that night. During the police search, a small key was recovered in the lot. Brought to the station, it unlocked the handcuff on Carol Duranch's wrist. Another witness stepped forward, reporting that as she picked up her daughter that night, she saw a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle speeding away. The signs were now unmistakable. The man calling himself Ted was not just a kidnapper, he was a killer, and he wasn't going to stop. Christmas 1974 came with a shadow over Utah. The darkness continued into 1975. In January, Karen Eileen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse, disappeared from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass, Colorado, where she was staying with her She was last seen walking down the hallway toward their room. Her naked body was discovered a month later, battered with a blunt object. Her left earlobe had been severed, and her body bore knife wounds. Samples were collected, but again, no suspect could be confirmed. Then came March 1, 1975. Two students from Green River Community College hiked into Taylor Mountain near Highway 18 to begin a research project, but they stumbled onto something entirely unexpected, a human skull lying just off the trail. They called the police, and King County authorities sealed off the area. The skull had a large fracture on the left side, likely from blunt force trauma. Dental records identified the victim as Brenda Carol Ball, missing since June of the previous year. Detective Robert Keppel led a team of over 200 officers into the mountain woods. Days into the search, while navigating a steep, muddy slope, Keppel slipped and landed at the base of a ravine face to face with another skull. Dental analysis confirmed it belonged to Suzanne Elaine Rancourt, the 18-year-old college student who vanished in April near Ellensburg, 140 kilometers away. Investigators believed the killer had specifically chosen this site to dispose of heads. No clothes or belongings were found, only skulls. The team scoured the soil meticulously. Some dug into moss-covered terrain, others peeled back thick ferns and debris. Soon, a third skull was uncovered. What was once unthinkable had become real. The forest floor had become a graveyard and Ted had just begun. The skull discovered was soon identified as belonging to Roberta Kathleen Parks, a 20-year-old college student who had vanished just a month after Brenda Ball. From Corvallis, Oregon, over 420 kilometers away from the scene, the revelation was deeply unsettling. It suggested that the killer had not only crossed state lines with his victims, but had also intentionally scattered their remains in multiple locations. All the skulls found thus far bore similar trauma, blunt force fractures, likely caused by a heavy object. The search of the wooded area continued. This time, investigators uncovered a lower jawbone. It took longer to identify, but eventually, it was matched to Linda Ann Healy, 21, who had disappeared back in February 1974, one of the task force's earliest known victims. Though law enforcement withheld many of the details from the press, speculation began to circulate. Some tabloids pushed theories of cult activity or satanic rituals. One newspaper even used the term serial killer for the first time, something law enforcement had carefully avoided. Psychologists and profilers offered darker insights. They believed the murderer was a deeply compulsive, obsessive man, likely triggered by a trauma involving a young, attractive woman with long, center-parted hair. He hadn't killed her, but he now sought out women who resembled her, again and again, violently acting out a rage that never brought him satisfaction. Captain Nick Mackey of the Seattle Police admitted a grim possibility: the killings might never be solved. More than 2,200 men matching the composite sketch had been interviewed. Over 900 Volkswagen Beetles were tracked down. Still, nearly 200 suspects remained on record. The task force, despite all efforts, had little more than shadows to chase. Then, in March 1975, another woman vanished. Julie Cunningham, 26, failed to show up to meet her roommate at a local bar. According to her friend, Julie had been struggling emotionally in recent weeks. On March 15th, she was supposed to meet for a casual drink but never arrived. Hers would become one of the least reported missing person cases in the entire investigation. Just weeks later, on April 6, 1975, Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, went missing from Grand Junction, Colorado. Later that same month, Melanie Suzanne Cooley, 18, vanished while hitchhiking. Her body was found 8 days later, brutally beaten, a pillowcase tied tightly around her neck. In July, Shelley K. Robertson, 24, was last seen speaking with a man at a gas station in Golden, Colorado. Witnesses said the man drove an old pickup truck. A month later, Shelley's body was found in an advanced state of decomposition. The cause of death couldn't be determined. Most of the women shared a striking similarity: long hair, parted in the middle. Then, suddenly, the killings stopped. The summer of 1975 brought a pause until one early morning. A crucial mistake would spark the unraveling of the entire case. At 2:30 a.m. on August 16, 1975, Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward was sitting in his patrol car outside his home when he noticed a light-colored VW Beetle cruising by. The neighborhood was quiet and family-oriented. A Beetle driving slowly through at that hour struck him as suspicious. Without hesitation, Bob flipped on his lights and began tailing the vehicle. As the Beetle's lights suddenly turned off and the car accelerated, Bob's suspicions deepened. He radioed on the license plate and initiated a high-speed pursuit. The car eventually pulled over in front of an abandoned gas station. A young man stepped out wearing jeans, a black turtleneck sweater, and sneakers. His hair was long, disheveled, and slightly curled. The driver identified himself with a license reading: Theodore Robert Bundy, a resident of Salt Lake City. When asked what he was doing in the area, Bundy claimed he'd gone to see the towering Inferno at a drive-in theater in Redwood and had gotten lost on his way home. Bob, who knew the area well, noted that the theater wasn't playing that film that night. His doubts grew. A second patrol car arrived to assist, and the officers kept a close eye on the situation. While talking, Bob peered into the Beetle and noticed that the front passenger seat had been removed and was sitting in the back. He asked for permission to search the vehicle. Inside, he found a small crowbar, and tucked beneath the seat, a duffel bag containing far more than expected: a ski mask, ice pick, nylon rope, and handcuffs, a tool set that resembled a burglar's kit. Bundy was immediately arrested for evading police and suspected possession of burglary tools. At the station, officers continued searching the car. Inside the trunk, they found a pair of green plastic toy bats, a pantyhose mask, and more duct tape. When questioned about the items, Bundy brushed them off as things he'd found and tossed in the car. Despite the strange discoveries, he was released the next morning without bail, but prosecutors weren't convinced. A warrant was issued for his arrest based on the possession of burglary tools. Meanwhile, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office began to consider Bundy as a serious suspect in the Ted investigation. They obtained a warrant to search his apartment. During that search, investigators found several odd items: a copy of the Joy of Sex ski resort maps of Colorado, and a brochure from a Utah recreation center linked to a prior victim. Bundy denied all connections. He claimed the brochure belonged to a visiting friend. Among the items found was a pair of shiny black dress shoes. But when investigators returned with a formal search warrant, the shoes had mysteriously vanished. Although no personal belongings from victims were found, no jewelry, clothes, or purses, Bundy remained a prime suspect. A photograph of his Beetle was shown to Carol Duranch, the woman who had escaped his attempted abduction. She was initially hesitant but confirmed that it resembled the car from that night. She also remembered a tear in the back seat upholstery now neatly stitched in the photographs. Additionally, a friend of Deborah Kent, along with other theatergoers, identified Bundy as the strange man pacing near the auditorium the night Deborah vanished. The final confirmation came during a police lineup. Bundy stood among several other men. Carroll and multiple witnesses immediately picked him out as the man who had tried to abduct her. From there, surveillance was launched. Investigators requested handwriting samples, school transcripts, and contacted family and friends in an effort to unmask the real Theodore Robert Bundy. And slowly, that mask began to slip. Bundy was born Theodore Robert Kowal on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Kowal, had no husband listed on the birth certificate, which had been filed at a home for unwed mothers. The name of Ted Bundy's father was originally listed on his birth certificate as Lloyd Marshall, a salesman and U.S. Air Force veteran. However, in a revised version of the document, his name was removed, leaving Bundy's paternity officially anonymous. For many years, there were rumors that Ted's real father was Samuel Cole, his maternal grandfather, suggesting a case of incest. But in 2020, DNA testing definitively ruled out that theory, eliminating any biological link between Ted and Samuel Kowal. Ted's mother, Louise Kowal, later claimed that the father of her child was a man named Jack Worthington, but investigations revealed multiple individuals with that name and, with Lloyd Marshall also residing in the same area at the time, confirmation proved impossible. To this day, the identity of Ted Bundy's father remains a mystery, and in his early years, Ted was raised by his maternal grandparents, Samuel N. Kowal and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet. To avoid the stigma of single motherhood, Louise was introduced to others as Ted's older sister. His grandparents assumed the parental role. It was only later in life that Ted discovered the truth about his birth, an event that filled him with anger toward his mother. Even before that revelation, Ted displayed disturbing behavior. His Aunt Julia Kowal once reported a chilling incident. She awoke from a nap to find the toddler Ted standing at the foot of her bed, surrounded by kitchen knives, staring at her with a smile on his face. Ted respected his grandfather, Samuel, and looked up to him as a father figure. However, he later described Samuel as a violent, racist, and misogynistic man. Though many believe Ted painted this dark portrait to distract from his own growing depravity of view, supported by several biographers. In contrast, his grandmother, Eleanor, was described as meek and submissive, entirely devoted to her husband. In the mid-1950s, Ted and his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she joined a local church. At a singles event, she met Johnny Culpeper Bundy, whom she eventually married. Johnny formally adopted Ted, who began using the surname Bundy. Despite Johnny's attempts to build a relationship, Ted never grew close to him. Ted's early life didn't initially raise red flags with investigators, but it later became clear that understanding his background was essential to making sense of the man he would become. According to Ted himself, his sexual fantasies involving women began during adolescence, and he engaged in voyeuristic behavior like peeping into neighbors' windows. Psychologist L. Carlisle noted that even as a child, Bundy imitated the voices of politicians and public figures, hinting at his early desire for power and attention. Accounts of his youth vary. Some neighbors remembered Ted as a cruel and calculating boy. There were stories of him allegedly strangling a stray cat with a clothesline after dousing it with lighter fluid. Another tale involved Ted leading neighborhood children into the woods, forcing them to strip, and digging spike-filled pits that may have injured a girl. Ted appeared socially detached. In interviews he claimed people saw him as shy, but in truth, he admitted he simply didn't know how to connect with others. In high school, classmates described him as well-liked and active, particularly in downhill skiing, a sport he practiced using allegedly stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During this time, Bundy was arrested at least twice, once for theft and once for auto larceny. However, when he turned 18, his juvenile record was expunged. In line with legal norms in Washington state, in 1965, Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, later transferring to the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese. It was there he met Diane Marjorie Jean Edwards, a wealthy and sophisticated young woman. Their relationship, however, was short-lived by 1968. While Diane graduated and moved to San Francisco, Ted continued working low-wage jobs. Despite this, Bundy participated in political campaigns, volunteering for Nelson Rockefeller's presidential bid and acting as a driver and bodyguard for Arthur Fletcher, a candidate for lieutenant governor of Washington. Nevertheless, Diane grew disillusioned by Ted's lack of ambition and immaturity, ultimately ending the relationship. The breakup devastated him and triggered a period of introspection and travel to Colorado, Arkansas, and Philadelphia seeking answers about his identity. It was during this time in 1969 that Ted learned the truth about his illegitimate birth. The discovery crushed him emotionally. That fall, he returned to Washington and met Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother with whom he began a long-term relationship. During the investigation years later, Elizabeth was asked to give a statement, but requested her account remain confidential. She described Ted's odd nighttime disappearances, his habit of leaving strange items in their home, and including a tire iron wrapped in tape, an oriental knife, and a cleaver. He confessed to stealing for the thrill of it. Elizabeth also described unsettling changes in their sex life. After reading The Pleasures of Sex, Bundy began experimenting with bondage and anal sex. On 3 occasions, he asked her to tie him to the bed, but on the 3rd time, he began choking her, frightening her deeply. Still, Elizabeth recalled that Ted seemed caring toward her daughter, Molly, revealing a chilling duality between the gentle partner and the dark impulses that would later surface. Bundy's relationship with Elizabeth seemed to coincide with a period of apparent stability. He began studying psychology at the University of Washington, where he was welcomed by professors and classmates. In 1972, he took a job at the Seattle Suicide Hotline, where he answered crisis calls with remarkable poise. After graduating, Bundy worked on the re-election campaign of Governor Daniel Evans, impressing the administration enough to earn a spot on the Crime Prevention Advisory Committee in Olympia. In 1973, armed with glowing letters of recommendation, Bundy was accepted into the law school at the University of Puget Sound. That same year, he reconnected with Diane Edwards. She was impressed by his newfound ambition and career in politics. The relationship reignited. Ted introduced her as his fiancée at social events, and everything appeared to be moving forward. Then, in January 1974, Bundy suddenly cut all contact with Diane, ignoring her calls and letters. When she finally reached him, he denied knowing what she was talking about. Shortly after, his once promising academic life began to unravel. He skipped classes and withdrew from responsibilities. By April 1973, he dropped out of law school completely, and not long after that, young women began to disappear across the region. The name of Ted Bundy's father was originally listed on his birth certificate as Lloyd Marshall, a salesman and U.S. Air Force veteran. However, in a revised version of the document, his name was removed, leaving Bundy's paternity officially anonymous. For many years, there were rumors that Ted's real father was Samuel Coel, his maternal grandfather, suggesting a case of incest. But in 2020, DNA testing definitively ruled out that theory, eliminating any biological link between Ted and Samuel Coel. Ted's mother, Louise Coel, later claimed that the father of her child was a man named Jack Worthington, but investigations revealed multiple individuals with that name, and with Lloyd Marshall also residing in the same area at the time, confirmation proved impossible. To this day, the identity of Ted Bundy's father remains a mystery. In his early years, Ted was raised by his maternal grandparents, Samuel N. Cowell and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet. To avoid the stigma of single motherhood, Louise was introduced to others as Ted's older sister. His grandparents assumed the parental role. It was only later in life that Ted discovered the truth about his birth, an event that filled him with anger toward his mother. Even before that revelation, Ted displayed disturbing behavior. His Aunt Julia Coel once reported a chilling incident. She awoke from a nap to find the toddler Ted standing at the foot of her bed, surrounded by kitchen knives, staring at her with a smile on his face. Ted respected his grandfather, Samuel, and looked up to him as a father figure. However, he later described Samuel as a violent, racist, and misogynistic man. Though many believe Ted painted this dark portrait to distract from his own growing depravity of view, supported by several biographers. In contrast, his grandmother, Eleanor, was described as meek and submissive, entirely devoted to her husband. In the mid-1950s, Ted and his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she joined a local church. At a singles event, she met Johnny Culpeper Bundy, whom she eventually married. Johnny formally adopted Ted, who began using the surname Bundy. Despite Johnny's attempts to build a relationship, Ted never grew close to him. Ted's early life didn't initially raise red flags with investigators, but it later became clear that understanding his background was essential to making sense of the man he would become. According to Ted himself, his sexual fantasies involving women began during adolescence, and he engaged in voyeuristic behavior, like peeping into neighbors' windows. Psychologist Al Carlisle noted that even as a child, Bundy imitated the voices of politicians and public figures, hinting at his early desire for power and attention. Accounts of his youth vary. Some neighbors remembered Ted as a cruel and calculating boy. There were stories of him allegedly strangling a stray cat with a clothesline after dousing it with lighter fluid. Another tale involved Ted leading neighborhood children into the woods, forcing them to strip, and digging spike-filled pits that may have injured a girl. Ted appeared socially detached. In interviews, he claimed people saw him as shy, but in truth, he admitted he simply didn't know how to connect with others. In high school, classmates described him as well-liked and active, particularly in downhill skiing, a sport he practiced using allegedly stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During this time, Bundy was arrested at least twice, once for theft and once for auto larceny. However, when he turned 18, his juvenile record was expunged. In line with legal norms in Washington state, In 1965, Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, later transferring to the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese. It was there he met Diane Marjorie Jean Edwards, a wealthy and sophisticated young woman. Their relationship, however, was short-lived. By 1968, while Diane graduated and moved to San Francisco, Ted continued working low-wage jobs. Despite this, Bundy participated in political campaigns, volunteering for Nelson Rockefeller's presidential bid and acting as a driver and bodyguard for Arthur Fletcher, a candidate for lieutenant governor of Washington. Nevertheless, Diane grew disillusioned by Ted's lack of ambition and immaturity, ultimately ending the relationship. The breakup devastated him and triggered a period of introspection and travel to Colorado, Arkansas, and Philadelphia seeking answers about his identity. It was during this time in 1969 that Ted learned the truth about his illegitimate birth. The discovery crushed him emotionally. That fall, he returned to Washington and met Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother with whom he began a long-term relationship. During the investigation, years later, Elizabeth was asked to give a statement, but requested her account remain confidential. She described Ted's odd nighttime disappearances, his habit of leaving strange items in their home, and core including a tire iron wrapped in tape, an oriental knife, and a cleaver. He confessed to stealing for the thrill of it. Elizabeth also described unsettling changes in their sex life. After reading The Pleasures of Sex, Bundy began experimenting with bondage and anal sex. On 3 occasions, he asked her to tie him to the bed, but on the 3rd time, he began choking her, frightening her deeply. Still, Elizabeth recalled that Ted seemed caring toward her daughter, Molly, revealing a chilling duality between the gentle partner and the dark impulses that would later surface. Bundy's relationship with Elizabeth seemed to coincide with a period of apparent stability. He began studying psychology at the University of Washington, where he was well by professors and classmates. In 1972, he took a job at the Seattle Suicide Hotline, where he answered crisis calls with remarkable poise. After graduating, Bundy worked on the re-election campaign of Governor Daniel Evans, impressing the administration enough to earn a spot on the Crime Prevention Advisory Committee in Olympia. In 1973, armed with glowing letters of recommendation, Bundy was accepted into the law school at the University of Puget Sound. That same year, he reconnected with Diane Edwards. She was impressed by his newfound ambition and career in politics. The relationship reignited. Ted introduced her as his fiancée at social events, and everything appeared to be moving forward. Then, in January 1974, Bundy suddenly cut all contact with Diane, ignoring her calls and letters. When she finally reached him, he denied knowing what she was talking about. Shortly after, his once promising academic life began to unravel. He skipped classes and withdrew from responsibilities. By April 1973, he dropped out of law school completely, and, not long after that, young women began to disappear across the region. While dating Elizabeth Klopfer, Ted Bundy, then known as Theodore, began disappearing frequently at night, often using Elizabeth's light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. Around this time, his alcohol consumption increased dramatically, something Elizabeth quickly noticed. She became alarmed by the shifts in his behavior. In 1974, as a wave of disappearances and murders swept across the region, Bundy was ironically hired by the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, a government agency assisting in the search for the very women he had targeted. A cruel twist that confounded the task force. With Elizabeth's cooperation, investigators began piecing together a clearer picture of Bundy's movements and lifestyle. She revealed that she had submitted 3 separate reports to the authorities expressing concerns about Ted's behavior, but they had all been dismissed until his arrest brought everything into new perspective. By the time the investigation intensified, Bundy had sold his Volkswagen Beetle. Forensic analysts carefully dismantled the vehicle, recovering hair fibers that proved crucial. Some matched samples found on Karen E. Campbell. Others were linked to victims Melissa Smith and Carol Derringe. While the evidence was circumstantial, FBI forensics expert Robert Neal stated it was statistically implausible for hair from 3 unrelated women to appear in the same vehicle unless they had come into contact with the same perpetrator. The task force became convinced that Ted Zine at Lake Sammamish State Park was indeed the serial killer responsible for a string of brutal crimes. Still, they lacked enough hard evidence to charge him with murder. In February 1976, Bundy was tried and convicted for the kidnapping of Carol Derringe, receiving a 15-year sentence. He was sent to Utah State Prison, where he quickly began showing signs of plotting an escape. A routine search uncovered road maps, airline schedules, and a stolen Social Security card in his cell. While incarcerated, prosecutors in Colorado officially charged Bundy with the murder of Karen Campbell, marking the first direct legal link between Bundy and a murder victim. In 1977, he was transferred to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen to stand trial. During his time there, Bundy claimed he was innocent, insisting he was being wrongly accused and expressing a desire to study legal documents related to his case. In a now infamous moment, Bundy requested to visit the courthouse law library. Seizing a moment of distraction, he leaped from a second-story window, injuring his ankle but escaping into the woods. He hid in a hunting cabin, surviving off stolen food and finding a rifle. His plan was to make it to a nearby town, but he became disoriented and wandered for days. At Maroon Lake, he broke into a camper, stole supplies, and moved north to avoid roadblocks. 3 days later, he stole a car. Exhausted and sleep-deprived, his erratic driving caught the attention of 2 officers who promptly arrested him. Back in custody, Bundy's situation became even more precarious. Prior to his escape, his legal team believed there was still a chance to avoid a murder conviction. A not guilty verdict could complicate future prosecution in other states. Moreover, his 15-year kidnapping sentence might be reduced for good behavior, but Bundy's escape altered everything. Determined, he planned a second escape, one that would have far more deadly consequences. While being held at Garfield County Jail, Bundy acquired detailed blueprints of the jail, and on December 23, 1977, while most guards were home for the holidays and inmates were granted limited leave, Bundy took his chance. He had lost weight intentionally to fit through the ceiling, removed a light fixture, and crawled into the attic space. Eventually, he reached a guard's office, where he found civilian clothes, changed, and casually walked out the front door. He stole a car and fled east on Interstate 70, but the vehicle soon broke down. After a series of stolen rides including hitchhiking and even flying under a false identity, Bundy arrived at Florida State University in Tallahassee, where he rented a room at a boarding house and tried to blend in. He found temporary work at a construction site but left after being asked for ID, resorting once again to theft and fraud. Bundy began stealing credit cards and cash. Within a week of arriving in Florida, the murders resumed. In January 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, attacking multiple women. He killed Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, severely injuring 2 others. Days later, he drove to Lake City, where he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Soon after, while driving a stolen vehicle, Bundy was stopped by Officer David Lee. A struggle ensued, but Bundy was subdued and arrested once again. From that point forward, Theodore Robert Bundy would never walk free again. While Bundy was in custody, his abandoned white van was discovered. Forensic specialists collected samples of leaves and bark lodged in the vehicle's frame. A botanical analysis traced the vegetation to northern Florida, specifically near the Suwannee River, a region bordering Colorado. Search teams scoured the area and eventually discovered human remains near Branford. Shortly after, in a remote pig shed near Suwannee River State Park, the decomposed body of Kimberly Leach was found. The condition of her remains explained why. Bundy once said he couldn't describe where she was left because the scene was too horrific. Kimberly had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and ultimately suffocated in mud. Deep lacerations were found on her throat and other parts of her body. Of all the crimes attributed to Ted Bundy, Kimberly's murder was arguably the most violent and disturbing. As jurisdictions across the country began preparing charges, prosecutors in Florida made their intentions clear. They would seek the death penalty. Bundy was offered a plea deal to admit guilt in the murders of Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach in exchange for life imprisonment. At the last moment, Bundy backed out, unwilling to confess. With damning evidence, especially from bite mark analysis on Lisa Levy, Bundy was formally charged with murder in May 1978. His trial became the first nationally televised criminal trial in U.S. history, drawing massive public attention. Bundy often ignored his legal counsel, attempting to represent himself in court, but the prosecution was well prepared, calling witnesses like Nita Neary, who had seen Bundy fleeing the Chi Omega house, and dental experts who matched the bite marks to Bundy's teeth. Carol Duranche also testified, identifying him as her abductor. Ted Bundy's trial for the attempted abduction ended swiftly, with the jury taking less than 7 hours to find him guilty of murder, attempted murder, and robbery. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him to death. 6 months later, during the trial, for the murder of Kimberly Leach, eyewitnesses were brought in, claiming they had seen Bundy with the victim. The prosecution presented strong forensic evidence, including matching fibers, which reinforced the case. In a strange twist, during the final phase of the trial, Bundy proposed to Carol Boone, taking advantage of a Florida law loophole that recognized a marriage declaration made in court before a judge as legally binding. In front of everyone, he proclaimed their marriage, showcasing the extent of his narcissism. On February 10, 1980, Ted Bundy was sentenced to death by electric chair for the murder of Kimberly Leach. As he left the courtroom, he turned to the audience and furiously claimed everyone was wrong. His mother Louise pleaded for mercy, but her efforts were in vain. Bundy was transferred to Florida State Prison. In the years that followed, he continued to receive visitors. During one of these visits, he bribed a guard to have an intimate moment with Carol Boone, leading to the birth of their daughter, Rose Bundy. In October 1982, early in his incarceration, Bundy agreed to be interviewed by Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. In these recordings, he often spoke in the third person when discussing his crimes. Later, FBI behavioral analyst Bill Hegmeyer was assigned to extract more undisclosed information from Bundy. Over time, a strange rapport developed, and Bundy began speaking in the first person, openly admitting to the murders. He told Hagmaier that the victims became part of him, that the places he killed became sacred, and that the act of murder was almost mystical, allowing him complete possession over his victims. He described his early murders as amateurish, but claimed that by 1974, he had become a seasoned predator. This confession suggested his killing spree began well before the known victims Karen Sparks and Linda Ann Healy. At one point, Bundy offered assistance in the investigation of the Green River Killer. Though he shared insights, the true perpetrator, Gary Ridgway, remained free for another decade. In 1986, Bundy's execution date was scheduled and postponed several times. During this time, he continued to confide in Hagmaier, offering disturbing details. He admitted to washing Laura Ames' hair multiple times and applying makeup to Melissa Smith's face. When asked about decapitations, Bundy confessed to severing the heads of 12 victims using a hacksaw. He kept some skulls in his apartment for a time before disposing of them. One of the most horrific crimes he described was the double murder at Lake Sammamish, where he claimed to have kept both victims alive to witness each other's death. His final execution date was set for January 24, 1989. Although delays were expected, no legal motions were filed to postpone the execution, and the court process moved quickly. In his final phone call with investigator Robert Keppel, Bundy confessed to all the murders in Washington and Oregon, even those he had never been charged with. He claimed to have disposed of Donna Gale Manson's head in a fireplace at Elizabeth Klopfer's house. As the execution approached, Bundy admitted to several murders across Idaho, Utah, and Colorado, including victims that authorities had not yet connected to him. He detailed the abduction and murder of 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Utah, revealing that her body had been left in Capitol Reef National Park. Location never confirmed. Bundy also described an earlier crime, the rape and murder of a female hitchhiker in Idaho a month prior to killing Wilcox. He returned to the scene the following day to photograph the dismembered body. Although no such photos were ever recovered, Bundy admitted to photographing many of his victims. Despite these confessions, Bundy continued to withhold some information, hoping to delay his execution further. His final lawyer, Diana Weiner, attempted to persuade victims' families to request a stay of execution, but they refused, stating they didn't need a confession to know he was guilty. Carol Boone, once his wife and the mother of his child, felt deeply betrayed by Bundy's admissions. Their relationship deteriorated, and Boone faded into a life of isolation. On his final night, Bundy told Hagmaier he considered suicide, not wanting to give the state the satisfaction of executing him. Guards were ordered to keep a close watch on him. During this final conversation, Bundy reviewed the list of his victims, totaling at least 30. He confessed to killing Julie Cunningham, Denise Albesson, and 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver, though their bodies were never found. Hours before his execution, Bundy declined his last meal. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds celebrated with fireworks and cheers. In his will, Bundy requested to be cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. Debate remains about his actual number of victims, with some believing he began killing before age 20. Bundy spent years blaming others, his grandfather, his illegitimacy, even pornography. Yet in truth, Bundy never fully grasped the gravity of his acts. He constructed strong walls of denial around his crimes, walls rarely breached by serial killers with long careers. Unlike the BTK killer, who described his crimes with chilling precision, Bundy never truly offered full closure. He died with secrets locked deep within, forever concealed.